Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful paradox, one that I think is going to fundamentally change how you view global sustainability. We're talking about the vicious cycle between poverty and the environment.
We constantly hear about environmental protection, and we definitely hear a lot about economic development, but we usually treat these as two totally separate conversations, right? Like we have our big economic summits over here and our climate summits way over there. Which leads us to a really compelling question. Is poverty inherently an environmental issue? Well, when you actually dig into the data, treating them as separate silos is a massive mistake. As we'll see, the daily survival of the world's poorest populations is just so deeply intertwined with the natural world that you literally cannot address one crisis without tackling the other. So today we're going to completely reframe how we look at poverty, specifically focusing on it as a critical sustainable development issue.
Let's start by getting on the same page and redefining global poverty. I want to look at how the Encyclopedia Encarta defines it. It says poverty is the condition of having insufficient resources or income. But specifically, it highlights a lack of basic human needs to sustain a useful and working efficiency. Now, pay attention to that exact phrasing, working efficiency. We're not just talking about an empty bank account here. It's a severe deprivation of the absolute basics: adequate food, clean water, clothing, housing, basic health services. And when you don't have those things, your fundamental working efficiency just plummets. You are quite literally robbed of the physical and operational capacity to even try and improve your situation. And that lack of working efficiency, it creates a massive cascading effect. Because these populations are stripped of their basic resources, they naturally become marginalized from the rest of society. I mean, imagine trying to advocate for your community's long-term future when you're literally just trying to survive until tomorrow. You can't. And without a political voice, they can't advocate for the resources they desperately need. Boom, the trap springs shut. These lifelong barriers are then inevitably passed down from one generation to the very next. It's a chronic, systemic trap deeply rooted in inequality. Now, this idea here brilliantly illustrates the core issue we're dealing with. For rural populations, a healthy natural environment is literally their social security. Think about it. You or I might rely on a 401k, an insurance policy, or a solid savings account. But their non-monetary economy, it's the forest, it's the soil, it's the local river. The productive functions of that natural environment around them are literally all they have to rely on to sustain their livelihoods. So when that environment degrades, their only safety net completely vanishes. So here is where the vicious cycle really kicks into high gear. First, poverty actively harms nature. Pure desperation forces folks into inappropriate use of wood and local resources just for basic cooking, heating, and shelter. People are forced to overexploit the soil just to eat today, entirely sacrificing tomorrow's yield. But then the cycle flips. That damaged nature turns around and harms the poor. When the environment degrades, it destroys their livelihoods. They lose their essential goods. And what happens next? It exacerbates urban poverty because people are forced to pack up and migrate to cities just looking for alternatives, which puts even more stress on urban environments. It is a continuous, self-reinforcing loop of destruction. To really grasp the massive scale of this desperation-driven destruction, we just have to look at the global footprint of deforestation that's caused, in large part, by the urgent need for basic cooking and heating fuel. 50 million acres. To put that into perspective for a second, that is roughly equivalent to losing 40 football fields of forest every single minute. Let that sink in. 40 football fields a minute. That is the devastating cost of survival for vulnerable groups who simply don't have access to education, alternative information, or sustainable resource management. The source text really puts this global footprint into a localized perspective for us. Every single year, an area the size of England, Wales, and Scotland combined is just completely wiped off the map. This highlights exactly how the hyper-localized struggle for basic goods violently accelerates the downward spiral of the entire global environment. And listen, people aren't out there cutting down forests maliciously. They're doing it because they completely lack the capital to invest in environment-friendly alternatives. It's pure survival. But the aggregate global impact, it's absolutely devastating. We can see the real-world consequences of this clearly in places like Nepal and Bangladesh. These nations have suffered from increasingly devastating floods that are widely believed to be the direct result of this large-scale deforestation. These forests face unbelievable pressures, and not just from giant timber companies or big ag, but from local populations that desperately need to use forest resources to survive, or nations trying to pay off third-world debts. Cutting down those trees literally removes the natural infrastructure that absorbs heavy rainfall, and that leads to catastrophic flooding, which, you guessed it, ultimately hurts the poorest populations the absolute most. Let's break down what this actually looks like on the ground. When poor populations are pushed out and confined to marginal, tough lands without access to proper training or resources, it triggers a rapid-fire sequence of physical and ecological hazards. The intense struggle to meet basic needs forces the overexploitation of the soil, which causes accelerated erosion and dangerous landslides. People are working the land as hard as they can, but without the training to protect it, crop yields inevitably collapse. On top of that, a lack of resources in poor neighborhoods means zero adequate waste collection. Combine that with limited access to sanitation, and you've got severe, widespread health problems.
Okay, here is the absolute core paradox of this entire issue, and really the cornerstone of why we must view poverty as a sustainable development issue. A sound environment alone will not alleviate poverty, but attempts at poverty alleviation that completely ignore the environment will sooner or later fail entirely. We have to tackle both together, period. The costs of past environmental mistakes are literally being paid by today's economy. Natural disasters, which are made so much worse by our mismanagement of nature, always hit the poorest countries the hardest. If you try to build an economy without protecting the environment, that degraded environment will eventually come back and crush the economy you just built.
So, how do we actually break this spiral? Well, it starts locally with relatively simple, accessible community measures. Obviously, universal access to basic education and vocational training is essential. But practically speaking, introducing things like local, low-cost, fuel-efficient stoves and heating devices can be an absolute game changer. It instantly lowers the energy bills for low-income households while simultaneously protecting the nearby forests from being completely harvested just for cooking fuel. It's an immediate win-win for the local economy and the local ecology. Now let's zoom out to the macro level. Poorer countries simply can't afford to take on global warming and climate change all by themselves. The air, water, and soil pollution generated by outdated production techniques often happens simply because poor populations lack the knowledge or the capital to invest in something better. So, international cooperation isn't just nice to have, it's completely necessary. We have to replace environmentally damaging technologies with environmentally friendly ones across the board. Wealthier nations absolutely must step up and help take care of the global commons, sharing the technology needed to uplift economies without burning down the planet in the process. And nestled right there in the sweet spot between the local individual and the global community is the municipal level. By supporting local municipalities and community organizations with proper waste and resource management, we can actually hit two birds with one stone. First, it creates desperately needed jobs, which tackles the economic side, and second, it relieves the tremendous burden on the environment, tackling the ecological side. When we properly manage coastal protection, water resources, and local fisheries, we're actually empowering communities to sustain themselves for the long haul. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought to chew on regarding this undeniable link between human desperation and ecological survival. Based on everything we've unpacked today, can we truly save our environment without first ending poverty? The evidence we've seen strongly suggests that as long as people are forced to make a choice between starvation today and environmental degradation tomorrow, the environment is always going to lose. And ultimately, so will we. True sustainability means sustaining human life just as much as plant life. So I want you to think about that the next time you hear about global climate policy. And ask yourself, who is being left out of the conversation?